Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session today called Generation Peat, Investing in Scotland's Future. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you at the Peatland Pavilion. I hope that many of you have been inspired by the incredible work and results shared over the past days from the Global Peatlands Initiative partners and collaborators, and that you're really making the time to exchange and build new partnerships for climate and nature action. For a country like Scotland, with very extensive but degraded peatlands, restoration offers a fantastic opportunity to cut greenhouse gas emissions while achieving a number of co-benefits and ecosystem services that we depend upon. Scotland's progress in peatland restoration is recognised internationally, and indeed the work and progress made possible by the IUCN UK Peatland Programme as a critical GPI partner has really helped us to feature Scotland's work as a case study, including in a recent UNEP State of Finance for Nature flagship report. This event will present the advanced state of peatland restoration science and practice in Scotland, and we will have the pleasure of hearing from experts speaking from a range of different perspectives, from policymakers to landowners and researchers to private investors. We'll hear a number of short presentations and share discussions where we will explore the practical steps and the multi-sectoral transdisciplinary approach needed to restore peatlands in scale. I really have the pleasure to hand you over to an absolute peatland champion, Andrew Millar, who's on the ground there with you, to guide us through the first discussion and introduce our valued speakers. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Diana. Ladies and gentlemen, Minister, speakers, it's a terrific pleasure to be here in the Peatland Pavilion, and a real credit to IUCN, to the Global Peatlands International, the Global Peatlands Initiative of UNEP, National Trust and others who've brought this event together and given us this space. It's particularly a success of Dianna Kopansky that you heard from a moment ago. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Scottish Government's Minister for Environment and Land Reform, Ms. Màiri McAllan, in whose portfolio the many challenges and opportunities of peatland restoration lie. Màiri.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Good morning, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today in the Peatland Pavilion, the first of its kind at the Conference of the Parties. This space, which the Scottish Government is very proud to sponsor, provides a fantastic opportunity to highlight the importance of peatlands for both people and our planet. Here in Scotland, we very much recognise the potential of peatlands as an outstanding nature-based solution to mitigating what are the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. And today we will share our experiences of peatland policy and practice, the challenges and indeed the opportunities thereof. And as the title of this event indicates, now is the time to act, to restore and to conserve our precious peatlands. Because if we are to end our contribution to climate change within a generation, as we are statutorily obliged to do in Scotland, and if we are to reverse the decline of our natural world, peatlands offer us a superb opportunity. So we must invest our expertise and our resources to secure a better future for these habitats and for ourselves. And I'm so pleased, as Andrew says, to be joined by such an excellent lineup of speakers with an array of perspectives to share over the course of this meeting, from the science and delivery of peatland restoration to those important views of landowners, businesses and investors. This really represents, all of us here today represent that multi-sectoral, collaborative approach that will be needed to foster the success of Scotland's peatlands, and actually global peatlands as well. So the Scottish Government recognised that peatland habitats are a key part of our landscape, as well as our cultural heritage. And in order to create conditions for healthy, resilient peatlands, we think we need to do three things. Firstly, We must protect them from negative impacts. Secondly, we must sustainably manage them for the future. And thirdly, we must restore and reverse as much damage as we possibly can. So on protection, we are taking direct action to protect and to prevent further damage from extraction. Peat in Scotland is extracted largely for use as a growing medium by the horticulture industry, with a much smaller scale extraction taking place for our whisky industry. In our crofting communities, we also have a cultural tradition of cutting peat for domestic fuel and heating, although that has declined in recent years. As well as the physical loss of peat, commercial extraction leads to the drying, the loss of biodiversity, and the further loss of peat through decomposition. So we've pledged to phase out the use of peat in horticultural practice, and as a first step in this commitment, we're taking forward a work to ban the sale of peat-related gardening products in Scotland. And through our forthcoming National Planning Framework 4, we've stated our intention not to support applications for planning permission for new commercial peat extraction for horticultural purposes, including an extension to the existing extraction sites. And as regards that second requirement of sustainable management, in response to independent reviews, we are taking action to improve deer management in Scotland, because we all know the impact that too great deer numbers can have on our peatlands. We've committed to introducing a wholesale ban on burning on peatlands, except in very limited circumstances. And finally, again, through that all-important planning framework mechanism, we are strengthening our consideration of development on peatland and carbon-rich soils. And on that final requirement on restoration, we've been supporting this for a number of years. Since 2012, around 30,000 hectares of degraded peatlands have been put on the road to recovery through actions supported by Peatland ACTION. That is the Peatland Restoration Programme that is funded by Scottish Government. This is really good progress, but like everything that I think we're coming to terms with at this conference and those of the past, there will always be more to do. So we are committed to significantly increasing the rate and scale of peatland restoration as one of the transformative changes that we need to make to meet the emissions reduction targets of our climate change plan. So we've committed to restore 250,000 hectares of degraded peatland by 2030, and will invest a groundbreaking £250 million over a decade to support this. This long-term, multi-annual funding will allow those crucial multi-year and large-scale projects to be implemented. This investment will support Scotland's rural economy, create economic opportunities, and those vital good green jobs that will be central to our just transition to net zero, which of course we are legally obliged to pursue. These targets for the restoration, they represent a real step change in our approach to peatland restoration, and we really do not underestimate the scale of the challenge that we face in realising it. We're working hard to raise the profile and public awareness of peatlands, and I think this pavilion and the discussion of peatlands at COP26 has really demonstrated that that is working. And we're also singing from the rooftops about the multitude of benefits that peatland restoration can provide. This is crucial because we can't do this alone. Government can't do this alone. The public sector cannot do this alone. We depend on researchers, on landowners and managers, farmers, crofters, investors, private sector, and indeed our rural communities to help us transform the way that we use our land. It won't always be easy, and just before closing, I would like to touch on some of the key challenges that we acknowledge we're facing in delivering on our ambitions. Firstly, on science. While our understanding of peatland science is improving, there are a number of gaps which remain in the evidence base. In Scotland, we're working to research and to physically map the location of peatland that will offer the greatest emission saving potential. And this is in order to target our actions in future. We know that different types of peatlands offer different potential emission savings, and it's important that we build our understanding of this to improve decision making and to be as efficient as possible. Science and research will also help us to develop and evaluate restoration techniques, and crucially to monitor the impact of our evaluation and our actions. We know that we need to understand more about this, just as we do need to understand more about the biodiversity impacts and benefits of different approaches to restoration. And there is much to learn on the socio-economic dimensions of this as well. Understanding people's motivations and behaviours, their culture, as we were talking about in crofting, and managing and restoring peatlands in a way that is sensitive to that will be absolutely key. And finally, as regards finance, another challenge. The Scottish Government is taking major steps to invest in natural capital in support of our economic, climate change and biodiversity goals. This includes that groundbreaking multi-annual investment of £250 million that I spoke of. However, again, that's not going to be enough on its own. We will require a significant contribution from the private sector to meet the pace and the scale of change that we require. So we're working to increase private investment and to improve our policies across the board in order to support that investment and to leverage it into Scotland's natural capital and into our nature-based solutions. So by working with the private sector on market design, market governance and operation, we can develop highly integrated markets that are more likely to deliver those crucial rural jobs, community benefits, and to achieve our crucial ambitions of tackling climate change and nature loss. We are listening in this regard. We do not have, nobody has a monopoly on wisdom, and I think that's why events like this are so important. Just touching very finally on landowners, managers and crofters, as well as securing those resources that we need to fund peatland restoration, we need buy-in, we need support from landowners, land managers and communities across Scotland. I believe that landowners have a really vital contribution to make in our path to net zero, to restoring nature, and by taking up the funding, the expertise and the advice provided by Peatland Action Programme. It really is a golden opportunity for climate change mitigation, and it is one that I know from speaking to landowners, they are interested and ready to move on. And of course, this includes our crofting communities who have a vital role to play when it comes to protecting and restoring our peatlands, because there are around 500,000 hectares of common grazing land in Scotland, some of which will include degraded peat. With the support and engagement of crofting communities, restoration of these habitats could alone make an enormous contribution to our climate targets and to our just transition to net zero. So we want to work to support that, because going forward, we know that determining the optimal mix of land use involves a set of interlinked and complex considerations that will at times be in tension. And that's something that we need to acknowledge and be prepared to resolve. So just to conclude, folks, peatlands present us with a compelling call to action and a remarkable opportunity. If we protect in and invest in and restore these key ecosystems, the rewards will be great. We can reduce emissions at scale, we can improve important habitats and ecosystems, and we can create good green jobs in our rural communities that are often so challenging in terms of jobs. It's a classic win-win. So I've talked today about our policy ambitions for peatland restoration, but now I principally want to hear from you. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoy the event.
Thank you very much to the Minister for laying out all of the different aspects which this community now needs to tackle, and particularly to tackle within Scotland. So I would remind you that on the point about communities, we have another event on Friday on the afternoon about the peatland rights and cultures, which addresses exactly the issue of how communities now use peat and how they will be able to use it in future. For those of you online, may I remind you that you can send questions on the right-hand side of your screens and for the Minister and the other panelists thereafter. We're going to move on to the second part of that delivery presentation, which comes to us from Emily Taylor from the Crichton Carbon Centre, and they're working particularly on increasing capacity, the critical part of scaling peatland restoration. Emily.
Hello everybody, can you see my presentation on screen? Fabulous. Great, excellent. Okay, well, hello everybody. I shall jump the gun and get in before Peter, who's unfortunately having some technical troubles there. But really my part of the talk today about the Peatland Action Programme is really about the people. Peatland restoration and peatlands are nothing without people. There are many, many people that stand behind that person in the excavator delivering the restoration works. And it's really about the need to understand what motivates people to want to do restoration. And that's from the ecologist, the hydrologist, to the land manager, to the deer stalker, to the Scottish Government. It's everybody has to be motivated and aware of the need to do peatland restoration. And it's wonderful. We are seeing more people than ever out on our peatlands, engaging with peatlands and wanting to do restoration. I think what's interesting is the approach that we have taken in Peatland Action. For many years, we have talked about the importance of peatlands to biodiversity. Increasingly, we are absolutely talking about peatlands and a role they play in carbon management storage. But we're talking now about peatlands and a role they play in water regulation, water quality. Our drinking water in Scotland comes from many peaty catchments. We're talking about the cultural heritage, the importance of peatlands, landscape importance. But in my experience and experience of project officers in Peatland Action, the thing that we need to be doing is making these benefits of doing peatland restoration real to real people. These benefits need to be tangible, and they're often at the very, very local scale. So an example of this is the work we do here in the southwest of Scotland. Here we brought together the Galloway Fisheries Trust, Forestry Land Scotland, Nature Scot, the Crichton Carbon Centre, and we're out there on a peatland talking about peatland condition. We're looking at the drainage network, we're looking at the forestry on the deep peat. We're thinking, how can we improve peatland condition here through restoration to realise benefits to water quality downstream for our fish and our salmon. So it's about understanding the local motivations, the local priorities for everybody involved, and the land managers that ultimately look after our peatlands. Here we have a local farmer, Màiri, who's actually overseeing her own ditch blocking project here. Màiri owns and manages a large area of extensive blanket bog. And together we prioritised this area for restoration because these drains were really problematic to sheep. Màiri was losing sheep in these drains. It was dangerous to livestock. So here we did a programme of ditch blocking and reprofiling to try and improve the ground, not only in ecology terms to improve the function of that peatland, but actually make it safer for her farming enterprise. So it's about these local drivers for peatland restoration that's really important. And the huge benefit of Peatland Action has been the funding of project officers like myself that can go out and talk to land managers so we can co-design peatland restoration projects that have real, tangible and multiple benefits for everybody involved. And this has been wonderful. This is a great thing for Scotland. We're now in a position where we have a lot of motivation for peatland restoration. We have a lot of people wanting to do peatland restoration. However, now we're in a situation where we need to make sure we clearly communicate how we do our restoration. So another major role has simply been understanding what is possible with restoration, the techniques that we can deliver, and how we go about delivering practical peatland restoration. And it's worth saying that this is an evolving area. This is an evolving science. It's an evolving knowledge base. We're now restoring areas we probably never thought we could. Here's an example of a forest to bog restoration project where we have removed commercial conifers that were not performing well from an area of very deep wet peat. And within 2 years of clear felling, we're seeing the return of the right peatland species coming back. We're opening up new areas of open peatland habitat. But the problem we have is that peatlands are actually very dynamic. There's a lot of processes going on in a peatland. So we have to communicate what we're trying to achieve with restoration in relation back to these complex processes that are going on in a peatland. So we often talk about peatland functionality. We're restoring peatland functionality. And in very simple terms, that's restoring the hydrology of a peatland. Peatlands want to be wet. The water table underpins many of these very dynamic processes that ultimately are responsible for carbon emissions. So we need to make sure the water table is performing naturally. We also talk about bare peat stabilisation. We now absolutely understand upland eroding extensive areas of bare peat, no good for anybody. We need to stabilise those. So we can take the complex science and the complex processes and turn it into quite simple ambitions and restoration aims. But we then relate this back to all the range, the myriad of restoration techniques that we can deploy in different sites and different circumstances. But as I say, this is evolving. We are learning how to do peatland restoration and good restoration every year. We learn more. Here's a great example. We ran a bare peat restoration course, or a workshop, I should say, back in 2018 in the south of Scotland. And here we have a group of very intrepid peatland project officers from all across the UK, from Scotland, across England, coming together and talking about bare peat restoration in truly terrible weather conditions. But that again is about knowledge sharing, understanding who's doing what where, how is it working. It's all very well, though, understanding that we need to do restoration, understanding actually it could be a really good thing for me to do restoration, understanding even how to do restoration. We now need the workforce that can deliver the restoration. So we need to be building capacity, and those will ultimately drive our machines and go out on our hills and do the peatland restoration. So we at the Crown Carbon Centre with Peatland Action have been running a training programme for the past 4 years. This we want to ramp up considerably, so contractors can look at peatland restoration as a viable option, a viable business. They can diversify their business to deliver peatland restoration across Scotland. So really, Peatland Action has been an incredible programme. We're now very sure of the why, the reasons to do restoration. We even know much more about how to do restoration. We have the techniques in place, we have the funding, we have the resources. However, it's about looking about what we can do now, but what we need to do in the future as well. So the role now will be looking at how we build our capacity to deliver for our hugely ambitious, brilliant targets for peatland restoration in Scotland. Thank you very much, and I'll stop there, and I hope I'll be able to hand back to Peter.
We're going to move on.
Tom, can you hear me?
And here, yes, Drew, we can hear you well. We're now going to hear from Drew McFarlane-Slack. The Minister already mentioned the critical role that landowners play. Drew's going to contribute not just for his own perspective, because he works with a group of landowners. And I think that system is an example which other countries will also find really quite interesting. Drew, over to you.
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. My name is Drew McFarlane-Slack. I am speaking from the Highlands of Scotland, and I chair the Mona Lea Deer Management Group. I've lived in the Highlands for around 50 years now. During that time, I've been a shopkeeper, a commercial fisherman, and a local politician, among other things. Mona Lea Deer Management Group was formed in the 1960s. It comprises around 40 estates and stretches from Speenbridge in Lochaber to Tomatin near Inverness, some 80 kilometres long, and from Fort Augustus in the west to Kincraig near Aviemore in the east, which is about 50 kilometres long. The Deer Management Group area covers 175,000 hectares of land and is bound around the area by a 2-metre high deer fence. The Deer Management Group is the largest of its kind in the UK. Its primary aim in the 1960s was to increase the red deer population in the Mona Lea Mountains to protect the number of stags available for sport. an increase in culling of marauding stags on low-lying farmland crops had created a perceived problem. The first objective of the new deer management group was to erect the deer fence I referred to, separating the high ground and protecting the farmland. The fence proved to be too successful, and by the late 1990s, the red deer population had grown beyond what was required, and several of the larger estates had begun to cull heavily to help improve the grouse populations and restore habitats by natural regeneration of woodlands. This intervention by these estates created tension within the deer management group, which, in addition to EU Natura 2000 objectives becoming live at that time, led to discussions and threats with by Scottish Natural Heritage, the NGO responsible for these matters, about the imposition of a sanction to reduce deer numbers with the purpose of improving degraded peatland to favourable condition. The members of the deer management group and the environment agencies were in deep argument about how to proceed, and agreed that the best method to resolve this matter would be to undertake a novel planning process involving all the parties, with the aim of producing a 10-year strategic deer management plan. This was eventually agreed, and with the support of external team of environmental specialists over a two-year period of time, the strategic deer management plan was prepared and accepted. We are now in year 7 of that plan, that 10-year plan. The key achievements of the plan during this time has been to reduce the red deer herd by 50%, while maintaining sufficient stags for estates' sporting requirements. Also to encourage new woodland planting and to restore to good condition 4,000 hectares of degraded peatland across the deer management group, currently around 15% of the total restored peatland in Scotland. This achievement is due in large part to the existence of our strategic plan, which has given us the authority to act, and the buy-in to that plan by private estates in the Mona Leas over the last 7 years, and of course the detailed management of the processes by the Deer Management Group and its technical advisor, Strathcollie Limited. The 14 estates who expressed a willingness to engage with Peatland Action were also convinced by other factors. Working at a larger scale over thousands of hectares, together with strengthened negotiation with contractors, made it possible to afford to hire the Deer Management Group's technical consultants to oversee all aspects of the works. This solution offered the estates continuity and management from a known and trusted team. Contractors too were much keener to be involved and to invest in machinery, in the knowledge that the Deer Management team had organised a large block of work in advance with a management system which suited their own operations and reduced risk for them. The estate owners were insistent that teams running the project had a proven track record. Where the estates had developed relationships with individual machine contractors over many years, they requested that only these operators on their estate at the beginning of the contracts. The terms of the overall management of the project, these landowners now had long experience with Deer Management Group technical team at Strathcollie, who had proved their credentials on the ground. One of the main constraints in the Mona Lea Deer Management Group's Peatland Action project was the requirement to bid for annual projects. We argued long and hard with the agency and the Scottish Government to extend the contracts to multi-year to reduce the amount of paperwork, and this was eventually accepted in early 2021. However, the Scottish Government objected to ramp up Peatland Action funded and indeed private funded restoration over the next 25 years. If it is to be successful, then the current system is not fit for purpose. Much longer term contracts will need to be put in place to allow all the actors involved to devise, order, buy in, train people, and commission novel machinery to carry out the works required. The current constraints that apply on high ground also need to be addressed. For example, the issue of breeding birds in spring months causes delays in getting contractors on the ground. The annual deer and grouse shooting seasons and winter layoff because of snow all reduce the time in any given year when restoration works on high ground are welcomed by private landowners. In addition, the time it takes to approve applications by Scottish Government agencies will also have to see a step change to advance a more efficient use of the limited time contractors have to operate in the field. And finally, there is the issue of the quality and permanence of the finished restored areas of peatland. The Mona Lea Deer Management Group has raised the issue of measuring the quality of the work we are carrying out on our members' estates. We are satisfied that the preparations, the techniques, the contractors and the drivers are each carrying out the works to our specifications, but we would dearly like the confidence that these works are being assessed independently and that a feedback loop is offered to allow continual improvement or indeed alterations to our works to ensure that in the long term these contracts are truly effective. There has been little or no encouragement for this within the Mona Lea project, which I consider regrettable, and this needs to be addressed by government agencies. There is no doubt that in the Mona Leas we have been uniquely successful in the last 5 years in delivering private sector run restoration on a large scale. In comparison to our peers, we have carried out this work despite the constraints that exist in the relationship between public sector funder and private sector delivery team. However, the relationships have been under severe pressure recently, and I am not yet convinced that we will be able to continue to deliver at this scale in the future unless changes are made to the interface. The Mona Lea Deer Management Group remains keen to be part of the future ramp up of work, but only if we're given the freedom to do so in a manner in which we can do it successfully. And with that, I'd like to finish my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Drew. So you hear there some of the real challenges for increasing the scale of the operation of peatland restoration, but also the recognition that this is an area which is well worth for landowners to address. I'll follow on now with another type of landowner. Ewan Andrew from Diageo is going to give us a few words on Diageo and that industry's engagement with peat. Ewan.
Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you to Professor Millar for the invitation to take part in today's session. It's truly an honour to be able to contribute to the conversation with such a great and diverse audience in such a pivotal event for everyone. Let me first of all say a few brief words about me and about the company I work for as an introduction. I'm a Scottish borderer, a proud Scotsman. I grew up in the agricultural farms in the areas down in the lowlands. I started work for Diageo 25 years ago as a graduate trainee from Edinburgh Uni. I am a zoologist, but I'm running a supply chain now. So I always talk about not just the climate crisis, but the nature crisis too. I've lived and worked on many continents around the world with my family, so ran our business in Asia, across in North America, down to Latin America, and then came home to Scotland in 2014 to run our global exports business. And 2 years ago, I joined Diageo's Global Executive Committee as the head of supply chain and procurement, but also double hatting as the Chief Sustainability Officer for the group. The last thing is I sit in the Scotch Whisky Association Council, so I represent and work very proactively across the whole whisky industry on many fronts, but particularly our recently launched sustainability strategy. Diageo is a global leader in beverage alcohol with a portfolio of iconic brands. Many will be known to you, brands like Guinness, Baileys, Smirnoff, Tanqueray Gin, and Gordon's, to name just a few. But it's what's made right here in Scotland that I'm most proud of, particularly our Scotch whisky brands like Johnnie Walker, Talisker, and Lagavulin, to name just three. We operate in 180 countries around the world. 180 countries around the world with more than 3,000 direct suppliers, and we work very closely with our communities from agriculture right through to production, manufacture, and shipping around the world. In terms of environmental sustainability, we set out our Society 2030 Spirit of Progress ambition for a decade of action to tackle climate change. They're aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and they're committing to net zero carbon across our direct operations by 2030, amongst a range of stretching targets on water, packaging and waste. And they come hot on the heels of delivery of our prior plans that saw us improve water efficiency globally by 50%, and already as we come into this year, make more than a 50% improvement in our carbon footprint as well. Those targets and that plan for 2030 are certified by the Science Based Targets Initiative. And ultimately, our roots run really deep in Scotland. So if you go back to the Hague family that were distilling back in 1627 in Fife, it's a business that's woven in the fabric of every part of society in Scotland, right out into the rural communities and the islands and in the major cities that we have as well. Which takes me on to the subject today of peat, the special role it plays in Scotch whisky and the role that Scotch whisky plays in the future peatland restoration as we move forward. Scotland is arguably the greatest distilling nation on earth. It's got centuries of heritage, knowledge and craft, and making Scotch whisky the world's biggest globally traded spirit today, worth almost £5 billion in exports to the economy pre-COVID. One of the elements of that economic success for Scotland is the uniquely distinctive flavour of peated Scotch whisky. The Scotch Whisky Association estimates that around 36% of malt and blended whiskies in the Scotch profile that are sold around the world have an element of peat in their flavour profiles. Peat has been used in Scotch whisky distilling for centuries, and it remains integrally linked to the flavour and the characters of our great national product. So how is it actually used in production in whisky? Well, it's not used in the distillation process itself. It's used in the barley malting process as part of creating flavour. We don't use peat as a heat source in the maltings process. As I said, it's purely just to create that pungent smoke. And we effectively smoke the barley. If you've ever seen it, it's fascinating. It's actually almost like a cold smoke that comes off the peat that comes and permeates through to the malted barley. And we're really trying to add the phenol compounds at different levels to give different characters later. As you know, whiskey is 3 years old, but we have some that last and come out 20, 30, 40 years, and these compounds are still there to give that character. And it's miraculous that they survive that distillation process, but they're a unique flavour contributor, and they're so much loved by people around the world. This means that Scotch whisky industries use relatively small quantities of peat in the process. Scotch as a whole accounts, as we heard from the Minister, but for less than 1% of peat that's used in the UK. As I'm sure you're aware, 96% of peat's used in the horticultural sector and 3% as fuel still, with whisky being less than that final 1%. Do not think for one moment that that does not mean that we take the stewardship of this beautiful country and the opportunity to combine the people and the places across Scotland with the opportunity to create economic success, but also care for the communities and the environment that we live in. Neither Diageo nor all of my colleagues across the Scotch whisky industry are complacent with that. So let me explain a little bit more about what we've been doing and what we're continuing to do as an industry to collaborate, to contribute to peatland restoration, and our motivation, more importantly, for doing so. The first thing is that we've worked for many, many years to reduce to a minimum the amount of peat required in the malting process. And through continuous improvement and innovation, we continue to explore ways to further reduce the amounts that we use. We've also taken steps to ensure that the peat we use is done in the most responsible manner possible. We've engaged with external auditors through our respected third party, and that gives us the environmental certification formally with the organisation to survey the land, assess and certify that the peat extracted for use by the industry in areas like Isla is managed very responsibly. In that process of certification, we've worked directly with our key colleagues and partners at NatureScot, as well as engaging expert advice from the RSPB Scotland on that restoration and remediation of areas where the peat is extracted. And we heard so much about some of the right and the wrong way and the education of that from Emily when she talked it as well. And I've been out on the plateaus, I've hiked in. I can't imagine what it's like to get equipment, people daily in and out of these places in the Scottish environment. And the Minister and I were there up at Abernethy in the Cairngorms, where we were launching a big project with Johnny Walker. And it's a beautiful wonderland to be in, but you've actually got to think of the practicalities of planning and executing and delivering on what you set out, and that's really important to do. So we ensure there's wide focus on that whole ecosystem to impact both the water quality that we've talked to as well, and biodiversity. And we want to continue to make those amazing whiskies that people around the world adore and inspire them to travel to Scotland and enjoy Scotland and bring economic wealth to Scotland. And on places like Isle and Skye, Isla and Skye, where people go on pilgrimages, right? I talk to people every day that are bursting to come to Scotland and spend time to do this. And it's not just to drink the whiskey, right? It's to enjoy Scotland and those people and the places that are around it. So we won't stop at reducing it and responsibly managing the use of peat, and we're committed as an industry to its restoration as we do it. I can talk briefly in a second about Diageo's peatland restoration projects, but I want to emphasize the spirit of the whole industry as I'm here today, and the collaboration and partnership that's well underway. And I'm going to call out one of my competitors. We said, and we've got very strong protocols with the anti-competition laws, but we work collaboratively on sustainability. And Beam Suntory, who own 2 Islay distilleries, Lafroig and Bowmore, just last week announced a £3 million investment programme to restore and conserve 1,300 hectares of peatland in Scotland by 2030. That project's being managed in partnership with the James Hutton Institute and Forestry and Land Scotland. And it's a great example of the industry working together with partners to really scale up and accelerate the levels of restoration across the degraded peatlands in Scotland. In terms of Diageo, back in 2016, as we celebrated the 200th anniversary of Lagavulin Distillery on Islay, we partnered with the RSPB Scotland team to restore an area of 280 hectares to blanket bog conditions, re-wetting the dried out peatlands by blocking nearly 1,600 metres of drains, building 154 dams to re-soak the peat and create those awesome conditions for it to return to its natural state. Just last year, Johnnie Walker celebrated our 200th anniversary, and as part of our plan to make it the most sustainable whisky in the world, we partnered again with RSPB Scotland to help save a crucial area of peatland degraded in the Cairngorms National Park. Along with other organisations who contributed to that restoration project, Peatland ACTION, the Scottish Government, Cairngorm Connect, it will restore an immediate area of 88 hectares and have a knock-on impact of preserving 160 hectares of peatland. We know that that peatland is also important and has a huge impact not just on carbon, but we've heard from other speakers too on hydrology. So as part of that project, we are monitoring the water quality in the tributaries that run into the Spey catchment river, which, as many will know from Scotland, is the Whisky River, right? The greatest whisky river in the world for management of our precious resources and one of our biggest ingredients. We know that as we add to those efforts and ensure that the precious water resources are managed responsibly, both for nature and for the broader industry. So to close, Scotch whisky inspires great passion amongst those who enjoy the product and those who make it. Our passion for the product goes hand in hand with our beautiful passion for where it's made and our passion for beautiful nature and the wonderland of Scotland. And we're passionate about preserving it for the future. It's a personal passion of mine. I spend my life, I sometimes get asked about my watch. It's a plastic Garmin, but I use it to track where I go, how often I go there, and what my impact is on the environment. And I know that I'm passionate, like many people here today, to make a huge difference. And it's about making a difference and accelerating it and doing it at scale and not waiting for things to happen. And it's the first part of this decade that matters most, not the second. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ewan. Great to hear those new projects coming online. We've had an opportunity for questions at this point. In view of the time, I'm just going to make one, and it's going to go first to Drew and then to the Minister. So, Drew, you were talking about the success that you've seen in the Deer Management Group's engagement with contractors. So have you seen that producing new jobs in that ecosystem of restoration contractors and workers in your own estates? Has that been part of the process?
Yes, we've now spent a number of millions of pounds of government funds on peatland restoration in the Monolea Mountains. That money, of course, has been passported down to a large group of contractors who are working as we speak on the monolias. So that's paying not only for new machinery, it's paying for training, it's paying the mortgages of the families who are downstream from the contractors who are working up there. It's providing a deal of new money into the economy of the area around Aviemore. So substantial improvement in the throughput of cash for that sector in that part of Scotland. And of course, the future would suggest that upscaling that to the level that's going to be required to deliver what the Minister was suggesting earlier on is going to be an enormous task, and it's going to require a great deal more contractors, a great deal more machinery, and just working out how the logistics of that will operate, because many of these machines are built across the world. They have to be manufactured, ordered, manufactured, and then brought here. Then people have to be trained to use them. That's an enormous job. I know that in Scotland we have great companies who are willing to participate in this, and I feel very confident that with the right systems in place, we can make all of this work.
Thank you very much. So, Minister, would you like to comment on how you see this area contributing to those green jobs and that agenda for the just transition?
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew. Thank you. So I think that in government we're probably facing two major challenges just now. One is a fair and green recovery from COVID, and the other is the climate and nature crisis. And I sometimes reflect that my government have two major cross-cutting pieces of legislative targets. One is the climate targets, and incidentally we're bringing forward an environment bill in this term which will address nature loss. But the other is our child poverty targets, to take children out of poverty. And amid all of the competing requirements of decision makers in government, we will ask ourselves, what actions can we take that will deliver the most co-benefits, that will tick the most number of boxes across all of those cross-cutting agendas? And then we're presented with something like peatland restoration, which, you know, we know when it's degraded, it will emit carbon. That has to be sorted. We know that if we restore it, we can store carbon. If we restore it, we can support water quality and drainage. And we can help deliver good green jobs in rural economies. So in that sense, despite being a very complex scientific phenomenon, for decision makers like me, it's somewhat of a no-brainer, actually. So we definitely see it as a key part of both our key climate targets and those socio-economic objectives.
Thank you to all those on our first panel. We're now going to continue the discussion with Professor Mark Reed, moving now to the question of financing that upscaling of peatland restoration. Mark's at Scotland's Rural College, and his current position follows a long engagement with the blended finance and the processes of engaging different financial actors. Mark, are you hearing us, and are you ready to speak?
I am indeed.
Okay.
Thank you for the opportunity. So I'm going to outline some of the key successes and challenges to financing peatland restoration with a focus on Scotland. I sit on the executive board of the Peatlands Code, of which I was one of the original architects, and we're regularly asked for advice by other countries trying to set up similar mechanisms. First of all, I want to explain a little bit about what the code is. You'll hear more about this later on today from Renee Kirkley at Hermans from the IUCN UK Peatland programme. Essentially, it's a voluntary certification standard for UK peatland projects that want to market climate benefits of peatland restoration by selling carbon credits. And it provides assurances to UK carbon market buyers that the climate benefits being sold are real, quantifiable, additional, and permanent. The good news is the code is growing really rapidly. We've more than doubled the number of projects in the last year, and there's more demand now than we can supply. So pending issuance units are currently selling between £10 and £20 per unit, and the highest so far recorded is £25. And of course, we expect that to be much higher in future as these are converted to verified units. Now, there's a number of challenges that we're facing. The majority of these are on the demand side. As I said, we've got, on the supply side, sorry, the screen is wrong. Demand is good, supply is the challenge. This ranges from lack of awareness, uncertainty on the part of land managers, complexity, whether perceived or real. Although this is getting much better, there are still too few advisors with the project development skills that we need. Concerns around contracts, market models, contractors. We've heard some of those challenges already from the previous panel. Now, we are doing something to solve these solutions, and hopefully there are lessons that go far beyond Scotland as I talk to this. We've been hearing about Peatland Action from the Minister and from Emily Taylor, and I think there's a big opportunity for all of the UK governments to create certainty around the eligibility for public funding if landowners enter into the code. And a big part of this is going to be designing future agri-environment schemes so that they effectively integrate or blend with private finance. Now, I'm going to talk quite a bit more about these in a session later on this afternoon, but in summary, there are three broad approaches we can take. First, we can go for full public-private co-procurement of public goods, where we integrate public and private finance into a single fund at a landscape scale designed to deliver multiple outcomes. Second, we could opt for coordinated public-private funding. In this model, public and private payments are delineated in space or time, enabling the market to pay as much as possible, while public payments focus on market failures or on those who are not prepared to accept private finance. And finally, we've got the business as usual scenario where public funding pays for, where private funding, pays for services that are not being procured by the public, but there's limited coordination with this. Now, one of these mechanisms is this idea of carbon floor price guarantees, and this was originally proposed in Scotland by Finance Earth to Nature Scot. In this model, landowners put together peatland code projects and enter them into a reverse auction, with the lowest credible bids being funded until the scheme's full and ensuring good value for money. A private finance facility could be made available to projects to cover capital works to restore peatlands, essentially offering loans that can be paid back over the project's duration. And so landowners would factor those repayments into the bids that they put into that reverse auction. Then, as the verification points are reached and verified carbon units are generated, landowners can then either sell them to the government at the guaranteed floor price, or they can sell into the carbon market if higher prices are available there. So in the best case scenario, carbon markets increase in value rapidly enough that none of the projects use the guarantee, and the government doesn't have to spend a penny. It can reinvest that money back into future guarantees. Now, complexity and red tape are regularly cited as challenges in carbon markets. I would personally argue that the Peatland Code is no worse than any other comparable scheme. In fact, I think it's a lot better than a lot of the schemes that are out there. Instead, I'd argue it's more important to try and actually train advisors who can help develop projects under the code in the same way that they currently help their clients fill out forms to access public funding. There's an army of trusted advisors like the guys on the screen here already working with all of the key peatlands landowners we work with across the country. And they've got the ability to make things very easy for these landowners if they can see a benefit in it for them and for their clients. Before I conclude, I think it's important to consider how the values and behaviours of landowners and managers come into all of this. I think we sometimes don't appreciate that when we're considering whether or not to engage with peatland carbon markets, there are actually two components that landowners have to engage with. First is whether or not to restore their peatland, but also they have to understand whether or not they're willing to do this as part of a carbon market scheme. And this, of course, includes moral considerations. So who is the person that's investing and what are their motives, as well as technical considerations. So things like the contract lengths that I mentioned earlier. So these two parts of the decision are influenced by a range of internal and external factors. Internal factors are more likely to influence attitudes towards engaging with carbon markets. So these are things like their perception of risk, which in turn will be influenced by their personal characteristics, cognitive biases, and the profitability of their operation. There are also pre-existing attitudes towards climate change and carbon markets to take into account, and deeper value orientations, which I'll touch on in my conclusion. On the other hand, external factors are more likely to influence whether a land manager is predisposed to considering restoring their peatland. This is things like their land tenure, size of land holding, and access to advice and support. So to conclude, I think if we want to build a stronger pipeline of peatland restoration projects for investment, we need to, first of all, ensure that the economic model is sufficiently attractive. This isn't just about the price per tonne of carbon. It's about the transparency and the perceived fairness of those prices, so landowners don't worry that they're being sold short. A peatland carbon guarantee could create that transparency and enable landowners to retain verified units for future sale as carbon prices rise, rather than brokers taking all the profits. Secondly, we need to provide certainty around the eligibility of people who enter into carbon code projects for future public payments. And third, land agents and advisors are currently advising their clients to hold back from entering carbon markets due to all of these uncertainties. But with the right economic model and messaging from government, this community could mobilise to start developing projects with their clients. These advisors, as I said, already have networks of landowners with strong bonds of trust. We therefore need to be ready to train these advisors as interest increases. Fourthly, we need to nuance our messaging to landowners. We need to focus on reducing actual and perceived risks associated with peatland code projects. Some landowners are likely to be sold on the environmental benefits alone, but this is typically those who have already got biospheric or what's known as social altruistic value orientations. For those who are more egocentric in their value orientation, messages need to emphasize financial benefits to the land manager, productivity, a sense of achievement, or the respect of peers. Finally, who delivers the message matters. I just published a paper that I co-authored, which was led by Dr. Nikki Rost, called "Have Farmers Had Enough of Experts?" In short, the answer is yes. There's evidence that land managers are naturally distrustful of information, government, researchers, and many advisors, and are more likely to do peatland restoration on the recommendation of other land managers than any other source. This is how to get back in touch with me if you want to read our paper summarising the various blending options that are available. Lots more on the website, including that paper, resilientdairylandscapes.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. We're going to move on with the finance before we come back to science, where peatland restoration, the science of peatland restoration started, and now where it is critical for the validation of all those peatland restoration projects. I'd like to call on our next speaker, Robert Hall from Federated Hermes, one of the companies which is getting engaged in this finance sector. Robert, are you hearing us?
Me just fine, thank you so much.
Good, over to you.
Thank you to both Professor Andrew Millar and the Scottish Government for the invite to speak today, albeit virtually at the COP Peatland Pavilion. It's a real honour. I'm conscious of time, so let me crack on. I'm going to try and use my 10 minutes to open the door on the mysterious workings of so-called private capital, or at least that part of it, demonstrably committed to investing in the equitable sustainability of Earth systems, and to provide some indication of the questions that need resolving when it comes to scaling up private investments into peatland restoration and other naturogenic sources of provisioning ecosystem services. Very briefly on myself, I work for a global institutional investment manager and a leading sustainable investment firm. We co-founded the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment more than a decade ago, to give one example of many. In recent years, the definition of sustainable investment has received increasing scrutiny and emphasis on the ability not only to talk in general terms about environmental or social sustainability per se, but to, quote, walk the talk and be able to prove it. That is, to demonstrate a rigorous and empirical process for quantifying the social and environmental impacts of investment decisions. My role at Federated Hermes is to be part of the team that moves us right up against the extreme leading edge of this paradigm shift, and to do so by systematically integrating into investment models the last 2 decades of sustainability science across the natural sciences, climate science, social sciences, including heterodox and environmental economics. In effect, we are seeking to realize the total synthesis of academia with the real economy and capital markets. The institutional interdisciplinarity of this modest earthshot has its challenges, but as investors of people's pensions, we don't want the convenient answer. We want the actual answer, the truth, if we can call it inconvenient it might be. We want to understand the absolute sustainability of systems. And for the last 50 months or so, we've been exploring opportunities to invest directly into climate change mitigation, adaptation and resilience, or net zero just transition technologies in the jargon, to ensure that this process is informed by climate science and ecology. We use IPCC 1.5 degree aligned carbon budgets as our interpretive or epistemic frame when evaluating such opportunities, and we distinguish between industrial negative emissions technologies such as direct air capture and naturogenic or nature-based negative emissions technologies such as woodlands, soils, hedgerows, marine vegetation, and of course, restored peatland. As we've already heard today, these latter nature-based solutions to carbon removal and climate change adaptation also produce a suite of non-carbon ecosystem services which flow from and through the natural environment into society. After more than a year in development, we've now established a high-impact investment strategy for the large-scale direct financing of climate change mitigating investment into natural capital and biodiversity across both land and sea in a manner which is both compatible with the fiduciary duty, that is the legal framework that investors are bound to operate within, and also which mitigates, I think, some of the core risks posed by such a strategy, including the new green layers risk, or a lack of transparency, local community input, scientific verification, auditability, like Mark's has spoken to so well, and broader ecosystem health. So this strategy includes peatland restoration finance. Structuring investments into peatland restoration at scale engenders a sequence of questions which must be answered before someone like me can evaluate the financial economics and environmental impact of the transaction, including the allocation of total risk, return, responsibilities, obligations, etc. I'll briefly attempt to set out this sequence below and a short list of the questions which might arise. Our first question might be, over what time period does peatland restoration finance occur? If we're transacting on the basis of the Peatland Carbon Code and say for 60 years, then how do we reconcile this with the fact that investment horizons are considered long-term once they hit 20 years? Perhaps you can simply novate the restoration contract once every couple of decades. But what happens if, what happens to the 60-year restoration liability incurred by the financer in year 1 if in year 50, for whatever reason, the source of finance no longer exists? If I want to price peatland restoration, I need to understand the total project cash flows, and I can establish total project costs relatively easily, but how do I establish the project income? To do this, I need to price the provisioning and regulating ecosystem services and the benefits generated by them by that peatland asset. So how do I price provisioning ecosystem services? Estimating the value of the benefits of peatland restoration requires me to first identify a fairly vast network of cause-effect relationships, mapping out who is impacted by peatland restoration, which is to say who benefits from the carbon reduction sequestration spectrum, water quality improvements, and wildlife and biodiversity enhancements. In order to understand how people benefit, I might need to ask them. Now, how do I communicate the complexity of provisioning ecosystem services to those that might be benefiting from them, but not currently be aware that they are? Does my communication to these individuals of this complex information distort the accuracy of the estimates of self-reported well-being benefits by those people who are not yet aware they're benefiting from them? Therefore, is there some element of performativity going on here, and does that matter? Is there any measure of self-reported well-being which does not in some way reflect the learned norms of what's valuable to people and why? Now, here I'm entering into the philosophy of value. We don't need to go there for today, but I think this exposes some of the underlying complexities at work when attempting to produce the certainty that Mark has described, which is required in order to value the provision and price that value of the provision of ecosystem services by peatlands. And we haven't yet got into the part yet where we structure this into a contract. But assuming that I've been able to successfully map the direct and indirect societal and market benefits generated by peatland restoration, and that I've successfully bundled these benefits into what we might call a social peatland restoration valuation model, I'm likely to find two things. One, that there is an enduring need for public funds to support peatland restoration activity unless either climate change fails so spectacularly that the carbon price reaches absurd levels, and I think in that instance we probably have other things to be worrying about, or another alternative might be that national legislation crystallizes regenerative obligations on those who either contribute to degenerative activity or benefit commercially from the provision of non-carbon ecosystem services, and enables the stacking of these non-carbon ecosystem services alongside carbon-based ecosystem services too. And the second thing I'm likely to find is that the present carbon offset market hierarchy does not meaningfully differentiate between privately held and anthropogenic sources of avoided emissions, where what is avoided was in the first instance the product of a private actor's choice, and natural sources of avoided emissions, which includes the preservation and restoration of some of the world's most systemically important ecosystems, including the Amazon, boreal permafrost, European peatlands, etc. Planting a hectare of oak saplings is currently perceived as considerably more valuable than restoring a hectare of woodland peatland, and this is economically, climatically, and ecologically illiterate. One of the things we're doing at Federated Hermes is developing a science-based avoided emissions hierarchy, and we'll be seeking the input of the academic community, including those speaking today, maybe some of those advisors that Mark mentioned shortly. To conclude, I think we have built a network of public and private organisations seeking to solve all of these complex problems. Many of them have been working on the establishment of the UK's ecosystem service market now for a decade. And at Federated Hermes, we believe we now have solutions to most of the above and are close to successfully concluding the realisation of our strategy for nature regenerative investment. So watch this space, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Robert. Really striking to hear how the finance sector is bringing together all of those different strands, which we've been hearing about from other speakers, in considering how peatland restoration projects are identified and valued. You heard multiple times in both of the past talks that those financing projects depend upon science. And in fact, the whole idea that restoring peatlands could keep carbon out of the atmosphere was also started as a science project. So it's fitting then that we're going to end with Professor Roxanne Anderson. Roxanne is one of the scientists who has brought together collaborations across many different institutions and across countries to address the science of peatland in one of Scotland's most iconic landscapes. Roxanne, are you hearing us?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. Loud and clear,
Over to you,
Andrew.
Roxanne.
Thank you. And before I start, just wanted to thank you, Andrew, and the Scottish Government for giving me the opportunity to talk today. I've already shared my screen, so hopefully, there you go, it appears. And I think I would like to highlight today and acknowledge that this presentation is not my work. It is the work of hundreds of collaborators that I've been absolutely lucky enough to call my peatland family over the years. And I am the voice presenting this work, but it is by no means my own and work alone. So please remember that this is the work of a truly extraordinary scientific community. In Scotland, we have an interesting situation where we have 1.8 million hectares of peatland, which represents about 13% of the world's blanket bog. Most of those peatlands we know are degraded and currently emit between 8 and 9 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. However, we also have the flow country, which is the largest expanse of blanket bog in Europe, possibly the world, and a candidate for a UNESCO World Heritage Site. To me, these two seemingly contradicting facts mean that we have a huge responsibility to restore our peatland, but also a responsibility to make sure that we look after that flow country, a truly important global resource. Despite being in very good condition comparing to most of the rest of the UK in terms of peatland, the flow country has not been spared by human influence. In particular, was targeted during the 1960s and 80s by afforestation by non-native conifer. It was a consequence of a poorly designed tax incentive scheme, and today still we bear the legacy of that misguided policy, or misguided use of that policy. Since the late 1990s, there has been quite a lot of large-scale forest to bog restoration efforts that have been deployed not just in the flow country, but also across Scotland, as we've seen in Emily's presentation earlier on. And I think one of the important challenges surrounding the forest bog restoration, in particular in the flow country, was understanding exactly what we were talking about in terms of the evidence base supporting the restoration. There was a lot of conservation initiatives to begin with, but some of the questions that remained unanswered needed a lot of input from the scientific community. Questions like, what are the long-term impacts of forestry, particularly in terms of carbon, but also biodiversity and water benefits or water quality? Is forest to bog restoration effective at returning the biodiversity that was lost and the biogeochemical processes that are so important for the sequestration of carbon? Can forest to bog restoration bring climate benefits and return peatland not only by offsetting carbon and offsetting emission, but also return this net carbon sink function? Can we map those benefits at the scale at which restoration is taking place, which is thousands of hectares at the time? And how resilient are the flow country peatland that we're trying to protect and to restore? How will they be impacted by future or even current climate change? This is not an undertaking that one can take alone. It takes a huge collaborative effort and it takes a lot of money. And in 2012, we decided that this could only be done in a collaborative, coordinated fashion through what we call the Flow Country Research Hub. I have the honor to coordinate this research effort, and since 2012 have seen the rise of a huge number of collaborative projects funded by all sorts of funders, and that have involved well over 100 scientists and project partners, stakeholders including landowner, government agencies, and non-governmental organization, a whole range and suite of partners that have delivered the science and supported the science that underpins the delivery of peatland restoration and protection. This has been achieved by the combination of all the different blocks that help us understand how peatland function: biodiversity, carbon stock, greenhouse gas emission, hydrology, water quality, but also the tools that we need to be able to understand these benefits at the scale that we need to. For example, remote sensing, drones and satellite. All of these need to work together and be combined and coordinated to be able to truly make a difference in terms of the delivery of peatland restoration and conservation. I think that the appearance and coordination of the research has been incredible in facilitating and expanding the perception of the flow country, not just within the UK, but also around the world, and has made the flow country becoming a centre and not just a remote peatland, a centre for peatland science. And it's worked, because with this network of coordinated approach, we've been able to demonstrate the first empirical evidence of long-term net losses, averaging a 56 tonne per hectare associated with forestry on deep peat. So no planting trees on peat is not a good idea as far as the climate is concerned. We've also been demonstrating the long-term effects of forestry and short-term impacts of restoration on water quality. Still today, areas of forestry are leaking carbon mostly through aquatic pathways. Net climate benefits of forest to bog restoration have also been demonstrated. Within 15 years, sites that have been restored can turn back to net carbon sink, and that could be accelerated even further as restoration techniques improve and vegetation recovery gets a bit faster. However, we've also demonstrated that there are legacy effects of forestry across taxa and slow recovery of biodiversity following forest bog restoration that was mostly caused by the rapid replacement of bog specialists by generalist species, and those bog specialists take a long time to return. The restoration of peatlands that have been afforested is not going to be fast. It's going to be a slow process, and therefore we need to be patient. We need to be able to give it the time that it needs. But the collaborative approach has not been only about the forest to bog restoration, it's also been about developing those techniques that enable us to monitor peatland restoration and condition at scale. And in particular, there has been a brilliant initiative that was led by Professor David Large from the University of Nottingham that took a whole suite of world-leading experts in remote sensing, peatland biogeochemistry, and peatland restoration in the flow country, where we sowed the seed of the potential to use new remote sensing techniques to monitor peatland restoration at scale, map peatland condition, but also to follow restoration outcomes and potentially monitor peatland restoration trajectory. This work has been funded through a range of different pathways and is still ongoing at the moment. It's been in part supported by Peatland ACTION program and shows that it's not just about the delivery on the ground, but it's also about the coincident progression of the scientific techniques that may enable a better understanding of restoration progress. The existence of a collaborative network has also been extremely useful at a time where climate change is becoming more apparent even in the flow country. For example, with the 2018 European drought and the 2019 wildfire. Having the network already in place enabled us to rapidly write two NARC urgency grants that were both funded and delivered, and these in turn have enabled us to better understand the role of peatland, the mechanism underlying peatland resilience, and the role that peatland restoration might play in improving that resilience toward future changes that may be recurring droughts or wildfire, or even just the change in the precipitation regime. And the evidence is stacking up that peatland restoration can help increase that resilience, and that degraded peatland are only likely to become even stronger sources of emission if the climate change is as bad as it's predicted to be. And of course, beyond the flow country and beyond the flow country research hub, there has been extremely good examples of leadership and collaborative approaches. For example, led by the James Hutton Institute, and in particular, Dr. Rebecca Arts, who I think may be in the audience, and UKCEH, for example, Chris Evans, that have enabled the gathering and the supporting of a better evidence base in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions across a whole range of different types of peatlands. And I've brought together some of the recent data synthesis from including UKCEH that have demonstrated, again, that emission reduction associated with rewriting are real, that can give the confidence to deploy restoration at scale, but highlight also the need to do it at pace. And to conclude, I just wanted to say that in the last 10 years, I have witnessed more and more that the science and evidence needed to underpin the delivery of the national peatland strategy and the restoration that we want to do exist in a space that is somewhere between the discovery science and the monitoring, the boring stuff, as we say. And collaboration and coordination are absolutely essential to make that particular type of science cost-effective and impactful. And much like for the practical delivery of restoration, it is absolutely imperative that we find routes to fund that kind of science and that we have long-term funding commitment. Because if we don't, what will happen is that all of this discovery science that leads to the development of new tool might not make it to full product. And also, if we have the skilled people that we build up, we might not be able to retain them. And therefore, much like in the practical side, I believe firmly that the long-term funding commitment are absolutely needed if we want the science to continue to underpin the delivery of what is a truly extraordinary program of peatland restoration. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Roxanne. And I'll just take the question from here. I wanted to just loop back to
which are currently being piloted. And my colleagues and I are working with those partnerships to think about how they can access ecosystem markets, carbon markets, and other sources of funding. And the great thing about these then is that we've got then these local networks, which include local communities shaping the decisions that are happening at that landscape scale, rather than it just being tied up between a landowner and an investor. Robert talked about the kind of land acquisition programs that are underway in the UK, and where these are large scale, there may also in future be the opportunity to create community wealth funds and the like. But the key thing is that we try and do that connection between local investors and landscapes, and then we can then plug in that national or international investment potentially through market mechanisms, but within the context of a place-based scheme that empowers communities to make decisions and to benefit directly.
Thank you so much, Mark. That's really very clear. And because we're running short of time, I'm sorry we won't be able to go around the room again as we wanted to. But I do want to just say, as the Global Peatlands Initiative team, as well as the IUCN UK Peatland Programme, we will continue to have these dialogues with these partners and follow up through the next months rolling off of the COP. So thanks so much, Mark. I wanted just to turn back. I hope, Andrew, that Honourable McAllan is still with us. It's a real pleasure to meet you virtually. I wanted to ask if you could, Minister McAllan, share a little bit more about what the Scottish Government's doing to support responsible investment in Scotland's natural capital. Minister, the floor is yours. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Yes, well, I think the first thing to say is that we're very conscious of it. So we have these incredibly stretching climate targets, and one of the reasons that we are able to have them is because of the enormous capacity in our natural world to sequester carbon and to support biodiversity, and peatland restoration is a key example of that. So from the government perspective, and we've heard from the experts here, but from my perspective, I think we've got two jobs to do. Firstly is to foster the conditions which will allow us to seize the opportunities. And secondly, it's to manage the risks for all of us, but especially particularly for communities. So in terms of seizing opportunities, we have tried to do that in the financial sense by providing that multi-annual funding to give confidence, but I'm very mindful of what's been spoken about today about some of the other challenges, and we're very much listening to that. And then in terms of managing the risks to communities, I'm in dialogue with Scottish Land Commission about how to design systems which embed community views and allow them to benefit from this land use and land use change question, which I think is going to dominate the next 10, 15 years. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Minister. I just wanted to tell everyone that we are at the moment at a point in time where we can choose our future, the future for ourselves, for our children, and our children's children. And I wanted just to encourage you to join Generation Restoration. We've got 10 years, and indeed, as our colleague from Diageo mentioned, this next decade is the most critical. So let's really work hard to transform the way we look at nature, the way we look and interact with peatlands, value them for the carbon that they are holding preciously and can capture back. I'm going to pass back to Andrew on the ground to wrap up. So much, everyone, for your time and interest.
Thank you very much, Dianna. So just to conclude, could I say that we've seen in this session that the single subject of peatland restoration requires a systems approach, and that we have a number of different communities that we have to engage. I would like to follow on Diana's last point. We don't have the time to engage those communities in the ways that we might traditionally have thought of doing it, by setting up an organization and letting it develop a vision and mission and testing them and seeing that they didn't quite fit, and then trying to do it all again. We need everybody in a room to understand what the process is, establish a standard that we will hold ourselves to, all of us, the scientists, the financiers, the people on the ground, and start working really adaptively to learn by doing the restoration and by giving ourselves that challenge of scale. It's fantastic that in Scotland we have a government that is ready to provide the public impetus to that, and also a private sector that recognize the opportunities. And so we're reaching out to landowners and communities and more of those academics that can provide the new science to make all of that cost effective and to show how Scotland could lead in being a peatland restoration nation. Thank you all very much for your attention.